Imagine a top doctor slapping a nurse, not knowing she's married to the hospital's owner. Curious how it all plays out? Hit that like, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Naomi, a skilled black nurse at the Sunbeam Medical Center, hurried down the corridors, her white sneakers squeaking softly on the polished floor. It was late in the evening, and the emergency department buzzed with urgency. Patients packed the waiting area, some were coughing heavily, while others clutched at twisted ankles or held cloths pressed against cuts and bruises. Naomi had become used to chaos, the overlapping voices, the tension in the air, the constant ding of monitors. Yet tonight felt different. There was a sharper edge to the atmosphere, a kind of restless energy that made everyone uneasy. In the corner, she spotted Dr. Romanoff, a senior physician known for both his surgical skill and his explosive temper. He tapped his pen impatiently against the clipboard, scanning patient charts with narrowed eyes. He was tall, with graying hair that gave him an air of authority and a habit of issuing orders as if he were the sole commander of a battlefield. While no one doubted his medical prowess, his manners often left much to be desired. Naomi worked tirelessly, navigating quickly among patients and staff, responding to each call light and muffled request. A young intern flagged her down for help reading a test result, a patient's worried relative asked her for an update, an elderly woman needed a reassuring word and a gentle smile. Naomi offered them all the same kindness and attentiveness. She prided herself on that, treating people with respect, no matter how frazzled she felt inside. As the minutes dragged on, Naomi noticed the tension building in Dr. Romanoff's stance. The ER was overflowing, and he seemed determined to maintain control through sheer force of will. Finally, she approached him with a crucial update: a teenage patient in triage showing signs of severe dehydration needed immediate attention. Naomi cleared her throat softly before speaking. "Doctor, we have a young patient in room 4 who may require for fluids and a more thorough examination. I think it's urgent." He looked up at her, his eyes stormy and distant. She could feel the disapproval radiating from him even before he opened his mouth. "You think," he repeated, making the word sound like a rebuke. "We have 15 patients waiting, nurse. I'll decide who's urgent." Naomi remained calm. She'd dealt with his short temper before. "Of course, doctor," she said, keeping her voice even. "But I wanted to bring this to your attention, her blood pressure is quite low." The buzzing fluorescent lights overhead seemed to sharpen the lines of tension on Dr. Romanoff's face. He set his clipboard down with a snap and stepped closer, crowding her personal space. She stood her ground, chin held high, professional but unwavering. She wasn't challenging his authority, she was doing her job. The cacophony of the ER faded momentarily as he leaned in, voice low and strained. "I do not need a nurse telling me how to do my job," he hissed, his tone venomous. Several staff members glanced over, their eyes flicking nervously between the two. Naomi's heart thumped harder, but she refused to be intimidated. "I'm simply providing information, doctor," she said evenly, her eyes steady. "It's what I'm here for." For a second, a tense silence hung between them, charged and crackling. Patients waited on the other side of the curtain. Machines beeped steadily in the background. Time felt slow, heavy, as if even the monitors and 4 drips were holding their breath. Something flashed in Dr. Romanoff's expression: frustration, exhaustion, perhaps anger at the night's unrelenting demands. He clenched his jaw, and before Naomi realized what was happening, his hand darted out, striking her cheek with a sharp crack that echoed across the corridor. The world seemed to pause. A stunned hush fell over the nearby staff and patients who witnessed the act. Naomi stumbled back a step, eyes wide with shock and hurt. She felt the sting blaze across her cheek, tears welling from the force and the indignity. Never had she been treated so violently, and certainly not here, in the very place dedicated to healing and compassion. She caught her breath, her hand pressed softly to her cheek. Dr. Romanoff stood there, chest heaving, as if uncertain of what he had just done. In that moment, the ER's noise surged back in, a distant wail, the beep of a heart monitor, hushed gasps from onlookers. Naomi's mind raced. She knew this was wrong, that it demanded a response. But she also knew she had to remain composed. She couldn't break down here, not in front of everyone. Turning on her heel, Naomi walked away, shoulders trembling but head still held high. The memory of that slap burned not just her skin but her sense of dignity. Little did Dr. Romanoff know that this would not remain a hidden injustice. Naomi was not merely a random nurse in his kingdom, she was the wife of one of the hospital's owners. And though she didn't reveal it now, that truth would soon come to light, casting his cruel act in a very different glow. Naomi's footsteps echoed dully in the hospital corridor as she fled the scene, each step carrying her farther from the sudden violence and disbelief that had just unfolded. Her cheek still throbbed where Dr. Romanoff's hand had struck, and the sting wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a raw ache of betrayal and insult. She'd always believed a hospital should be a place of empathy and healing, and yet she'd just been attacked by a physician, someone who should embody the very values of care and respect. She needed a quiet place to gather herself, somewhere away from the curious, pitying stares of colleagues and patients who had witnessed the slap. Ducking into an empty supply closet, she clicked the door shut behind her, letting the muted hum of ventilation fans and the faint scent of antiseptic envelop her. She pressed the back of her hand gently against her bruised cheek. Her breath came in shallow waves, as though even the air felt heavier now. In that narrow, dimly lit space, Naomi allowed herself a few moments to feel what she felt. Anger simmered beneath shock and sorrow. She had dedicated her life to nursing, to comforting the frightened, to assisting the healers, and to showing compassion to those in pain. She deserved dignity, not a blow to the face. A tear escaped the corner of her eye and trickled down, but she quickly wiped it away. She would not be defined by this moment of cruelty. Her thoughts turned to Emmanuel, her husband, who was somewhere in the hospital today. He had intended to make an unannounced visit, observing how the staff interacted, ensuring that the facility he co-owned upheld its standards of patient-centered care and professional integrity. Emmanuel had always been calm and principled, working behind the scenes to maintain fairness and quality. Naomi often kept her marriage to him low profile at work, it was easier that way, letting her be judged on her own merit rather than her connection to the administration. But now, that discretion felt like a heavy secret pressing on her. Did Dr. Romanoff realize who he had struck? Probably not. He treated her like an obstacle, nothing more than a nurse he could belittle and dismiss. Perhaps he even believed it would never leave the cramped walls of the ER. Naomi closed her eyes, steadying herself, considering what to do next. She couldn't simply return to work as though nothing had happened. She also didn't want to make a scene or react out of sheer fury. She needed to think calmly and with purpose. A soft knock on the closet door startled her. She froze, uncertain whether to answer, but when she heard the gentle whisper of her name, Naomi? Are you all right? She recognized the voice of Lisa, a fellow nurse who'd started at the hospital just a year ago. Naomi hesitated, then opened the door a crack. Lisa's eyes brimmed with concern. She had witnessed the incident, as had half the ER staff. Her expression said it all, disbelief, sorrow, solidarity. I'm fine, Naomi said, voice trembling despite her effort to sound composed. She stepped into the hallway, letting the door click shut, and Lisa studied her face with empathy. I can't believe he did that, Lisa breathed, voice low so as not to draw attention. We should report him immediately. Naomi nodded, pressing her lips together. She knew Lisa was right, but she also knew this wasn't just a question of filing a routine complaint. The gravity of the incident demanded more than a standard HR form. I'll handle it, Naomi said, mustering a steady tone. But first, I need to find Emmanuel. Lisa frowned, confused. Emmanuel, the businessman who came in today. She didn't know the whole story, nobody did, but she trusted Naomi. All right, she said, touching Naomi's arm lightly. Just know you're not alone. We all saw. We're all disgusted. That support was like a small, steady flame in a cold room. Naomi gave Lisa a faint smile of gratitude. Thank you, she managed. With that, Lisa returned to the ER, and Naomi turned down the corridor that led to the administrative wing, where Emmanuel often met with department heads and reviewed the day-to-day operations. Her heart pounded as she walked, replaying the scene in her head. The slap was more than a personal insult, it revealed a rotten core of arrogance and disrespect in a man entrusted with human lives. She imagined how Emmanuel would react. He would be furious, no doubt, but he would also be deliberate. He would not storm the ER in a rage, he would seek out the truth openly, demand accountability, and stand firmly by her side. Naomi rounded a corner and spotted Emmanuel through a glass partition. He was conversing quietly with Dr. Santos, a pediatric specialist known for kindness and competence. As Naomi approached, Emmanuel glanced her way, and his polite smile vanished at once. He saw something in her face, pain, humiliation, and a determined light that told him this was no minor matter. Excusing himself from the conversation, he stepped toward her. Naomi, he said gently, voice full of concern. What's happened? Naomi met his eyes, finally letting the protective wall slip just enough. She trusted him with everything. Emmanuel, she began, voice steady but thick with emotion, we need to talk. Dr. Romanoff, he struck me. Emmanuel's calm demeanor faltered, replaced by a tension in his jaw and a cool fire in his eyes. He didn't explode or raise his voice, he didn't need to. Come with me, he said simply, placing a hand on her arm. As they turned to find a private place to speak, Naomi knew that a quiet storm was gathering. The hospital was about to learn who she truly was, and Dr. Romanoff, who thought he could mistreat a nurse without consequence, would soon face a reckoning he never anticipated. In that corridor, with the faint hum of machinery and distant footsteps of staff, a line had been crossed and a path forward would lead to justice, no matter how many truths had to be laid bare in the process. Emmanuel guided Naomi into a small administrative office, its glass walls offering a partial view of the hallway but still granting them enough privacy to speak openly. He closed the door softly behind them, and the hush that fell over the room contrasted sharply with the clamor of the busy hospital beyond. Naomi settled into a chair, folding her hands in her lap. She could still feel the lingering warmth and sting on her cheek. Emmanuel stood before her, arms crossed, his face grave but composed. He had always been a steady force, someone who weighed his words carefully and acted with measured purpose. Now, he studied Naomi's expression, noting the pain, the anger, and the resilience that flickered behind her eyes. Tell me everything, he said quietly. There was no harshness in his tone, just resolve. He knelt down beside her chair to meet her gaze at eye level, offering the comfort of closeness without crowding her. Naomi recounted the incident, the crowded ER, Dr. Romanoff's growing impatience, her attempt to alert him to a patient's urgent condition, and the sudden, shocking slap. She described the hush that followed, the stunned faces of her colleagues, and her retreat into the supply closet to steady herself. As she spoke, Emmanuel's expression hardened, not into rage, but into a cool, focused determination. He understood that what had occurred was more than a personal slight, it was a fundamental violation of the values upon which they had built this hospital. Romanoff's behavior is unacceptable, Emmanuel said, voice low and steady. No title, no degree, no amount of skill can excuse such an act. He has broken the trust not only between colleagues but also with the institution itself. Naomi nodded, relief mixing with the lingering hurt. She trusted Emmanuel to handle this properly. He had a gift for turning moral outrage into constructive action. I know we must address it, she said softly. But I didn't want to come running to you the moment it happened. I wanted to be sure of what I felt, to understand that I'm not just reacting in anger. I want justice, Emmanuel, not a scene. I want this hospital to live up to the principles we care about. Emmanuel reached for her hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "You never have to worry about overreacting when you've been harmed," he said. "Your pain matters. But I understand, you want to do this the right way. So do I." He stood and paced to the window that overlooked the city lights beyond. Evening had deepened, and the distant glow of street lamps dotted the horizon. Turning back to Naomi, he continued, "We will call a meeting with the senior medical staff, hospital administrators, and the head of HR. We'll do it tonight. This cannot wait until morning. Everyone present will hear the truth of what happened." Naomi inhaled slowly, relieved that she wouldn't bear the burden alone. She knew that Emmanuel would insist on transparency and due process. He wouldn't allow this to be brushed under the rug, no quiet settlement, no whispered apologies that left lingering scars. He would shine a light on it, ensuring that everyone understood how serious this was. "And Romanov?" she asked softly. "He's working tonight. The ER is packed. Patients need help. What will we do about him until we can have that meeting?" Emmanuel's jaw tightened. "First, I'll speak to the charge nurse and the hospital's COO. We'll arrange for another physician to take over Romanov's critical duties. He'll be asked to step aside, at least temporarily. We cannot allow him to continue unsupervised after what he's done." Naomi nodded. She felt a surge of gratitude and pride. When she married Emmanuel, it wasn't just because she loved his calm smile, his kind eyes, and his integrity, though all those things were true. She admired his unwavering commitment to doing what was right, even when it was uncomfortable. A light knock on the door startled them both. Emmanuel opened it, revealing Dr. Santos, who looked anxious and uncertain. "Emmanuel, I don't mean to intrude, but I heard rumors something unpleasant happened in the ER. Is Naomi all right?" Naomi mustered a small smile. She appreciated Dr. Santos's concern. A pediatric specialist with a gentle bedside manner, he was known for looking out for the well-being of everyone on staff. "I'm fine, Dr. Santos," she said calmly. "But something unacceptable occurred, and Emmanuel and I are going to address it." Dr. Santos inclined his head. "Count me in," he said quietly. "We've worked too hard to build a positive environment here. This can't be ignored." Emmanuel placed a grateful hand on Dr. Santos's shoulder. "We'll need your support. I'm calling a meeting shortly. Please notify the others. We must have transparency and accountability." As Dr. Santos slipped away to spread the word, Naomi rose from her chair, her spine straight and her resolve gathered. The sting on her cheek had faded to a dull ache, but her determination burned brighter than ever. She wasn't just a victim here, she was a professional who demanded respect, a nurse who deserved better, and a partner committed to upholding the values that she and Emmanuel cherished. They stepped out of the office together, husband and wife, owner and nurse, united in purpose. Tonight, the corridors would not be hushed by silence or fear. Instead, the hospital staff would gather and confront the truth, ensuring that, going forward, no one would forget that decency and dignity were non-negotiable. Later that evening, the hospital's small conference room began to fill with an unusual group of attendees. Under normal circumstances, a late-night meeting might involve only the night shift supervisors reviewing patient charts or discussing a supply shortage. But this was no ordinary meeting. Emmanuel's urgent request had reached every corner of Sunbeam Medical Center. Senior doctors, nurses, administrative heads, and HR representatives now drifted into the room with curious, concerned expressions. Whispers fluttered through the crowd. Some had heard half rumors about an incident in the ER, something involving Dr. Romanov and a nurse. Others had caught the tense look on Emmanuel's face as he paced through the halls, instructing staff to find replacements for Romanov's patients. Whatever had happened, it was serious enough to merit an immediate assembly of all the key players. Naomi stood close to Emmanuel near the long wooden table at the front of the room. She had changed into a fresh set of scrubs, and though the faint redness on her cheek remained, her demeanor was poised and resolute. She offered a tight smile to those who came up to ask if she was all right. Her colleagues, many of whom she considered friends, gave her nods of encouragement. A few squeezed her hand in silent support. Dr. Santos took a seat near the front, his arms folded across his chest, a protective stance that said he was ready to stand by Naomi's side. Lisa, the young nurse who had found Naomi in the supply closet, hovered nearby, her eyes bright with sympathy and anger. Other physicians and nurses glanced about, waiting for an explanation. HR's representative, Ms. Price, arrived with a small notepad and a solemn expression, prepared to document every detail. It didn't take long for Dr. Romanoff himself to appear, summoned from the ER where another doctor had taken over his responsibilities. He entered looking strained, his forehead creased and eyes narrowed. He offered no greeting as he slipped into a seat at the far end of the table. He recognized Emmanuel immediately. One did not simply fail to know who owned a stake in the hospital, but his gaze remained fixed on his own clasped hands, as if bracing for impact. At last, Emmanuel cleared his throat. His presence commanded attention without need for theatrics. He stood tall, shoulders back, his voice resonating softly but firmly throughout the room. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began. "I know this is an unusual time to convene, but the matter at hand could not wait." A hush fell over the room. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly. Outside the windows, the city's nighttime glow shimmered, a distant reminder that life went on while they confronted this internal crisis. "Earlier tonight," Emmanuel continued, "an incident occurred in the emergency department. I have asked you here because it concerns not only the individuals involved but the values we hold as a hospital: respect, compassion, and ethical conduct." Naomi took a half step forward, and Emmanuel reached for her hand. He squeezed it gently before turning back to the gathered staff. "Dr. Romanoff, a respected physician in many regards, committed an act of physical and emotional harm against one of our nurses." A ripple of tension passed through the crowd. Some gasped softly, others exchanged startled glances. Dr. Romanoff's shoulders stiffened, but he said nothing yet. Emmanuel continued, voice calm but firm. "He struck Nurse Naomi Johnson, my wife, during an exchange about a patient's urgent needs." Eyes darted to Naomi, then to Dr. Romanoff, then back to Emmanuel. The revelation of Naomi's relationship to the hospital's leadership only heightened the shock. The silence became charged, as though everyone was holding their breath at the same time. Naomi lifted her chin, meeting the eyes of those who looked her way. She would not cower. If she could stand steady during emergencies, she could do the same now. She had nothing to hide, the shame lay entirely with Dr. Romanoff's actions. Ms. Price, from HR, cleared her throat. I think we need to hear directly from the parties involved. Naomi, if you are willing, could you describe what happened?" Naomi nodded, her voice measured and calm as she recounted the events. She kept to the facts: the crowded ER, her approach to Dr. Romanoff, his refusal to listen, and finally, the slap that had stunned everyone into silence. She did not embellish or dramatize. The truth was damning enough on its own. The listeners stared in horrified disbelief. Some shook their heads, others shot accusatory glances at Dr. Romanoff. Emmanuel let Naomi finish without interruption, then nodded to Lisa, who confirmed the nurse's account, her voice trembling with outrage. With nowhere to hide, Dr. Romanoff finally spoke. He started haltingly, stumbling over words, trying to justify his behavior with talk of stress, patient overload, and the strain of working under pressure. But as he talked, it became clear that his reasons were weak. No level of stress could excuse striking a colleague, especially one as dedicated and respectful as Naomi. The defensive edge in his voice only made things worse. Emmanuel's expression remained unreadable, his gaze fixed on Dr. Romanoff. When the doctor finished, Emmanuel let the silence stretch, letting every person in the room feel the gravity of what had happened. Finally, Emmanuel said, "We all face stress in this hospital, doctor. That stress is why we must support each other, not lash out. We are here to heal, not to harm. He looked to Ms. Price. I believe HR should start a formal investigation and decide on disciplinary action. In the meantime, Dr. Romanoff will not be allowed to continue working unsupervised. His privileges will be suspended until we conclude this matter. A wave of relief swept through the room, as if everyone had silently agreed that this was the right course. Naomi's heart pounded less fiercely now, knowing she had been heard, her pain acknowledged, and the wheels of justice set in motion. As the meeting ended, the staff dispersed quietly, their faces solemn. The hospital corridors that were once filled with hurried steps and clinical chatter now bore a sense of introspection. Those who saw Naomi as just another nurse now understood her deeper connection to the place. And those who respected Emmanuel before now respected him even more for handling such a delicate crisis with fairness and resolve. Naomi stepped outside the conference room into the corridor's soft lighting. Emmanuel was right behind her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. In that moment, she realized that while the sting of humiliation and pain might linger, something stronger had taken root. She had stood up, and her community had stood with her. The path forward would be filled with challenges, but this hospital would not turn a blind eye. Tonight they had begun the delicate work of healing, both the physical ailments of their patients and the moral wounds within their own ranks. The night's tension lingered like an unsettling echo through the corridors of Sunbeam Medical Center. After the meeting, staff members dispersed quietly, each lost in their own thoughts. Naomi remained near Emmanuel, their footsteps measured as they headed back toward the ER. Though justice had been set in motion, the emotional weight of the night's events still pressed heavily on her. As they turned a corner, Naomi noticed Dr. Romanoff standing near a vending machine, his posture stiff and uncertain. He had no patients to attend to now, his privileges were temporarily suspended, and he seemed adrift in the very hospital where he once wielded unquestioned authority. Catching sight of them, he looked away, shoulders slumped. Emmanuel guided Naomi gently in another direction, wanting to spare her further discomfort. They made their way into the ER's main bay, where nurses worked with hushed efficiency and a few doctors carefully tended to patients. Despite the late hour, the hospital's pulse remained steady, infants cried softly, monitors beeped, and stretchers rolled along the glossy floors. Just as Naomi began to think the worst of the night was behind them, the ambulance doors at the far end of the hall burst open. 2 paramedics rushed in, pushing a gurney bearing a man in his 40s. His breathing was labored, his face ashen. One of the paramedics called out, "We've got a severe abdominal trauma. We need immediate surgical intervention." The urgency crackled like electricity in the air. Naomi's heart tightened. She scanned the room for a qualified surgeon. Dr. Santos stepped forward, but his specialty was pediatrics. He could help stabilize, but this patient needed a trauma surgeon's skill. Another doctor, Dr. Collins, was stuck in the OR with a tricky procedure. The clock was ticking, and the patient's life hung in the balance. That was when she spotted Dr. Romanoff, lingering uncertainly at the edge of the bay. Despite everything, he was one of the hospital's most experienced trauma surgeons. His skill in the operating room was undeniable. But he had just been barred from practicing unsupervised. Could they trust him now? Could they afford not to? Emmanuel followed her gaze, and their eyes met, each silently weighing the same agonizing dilemma. The hospital's guiding principle was patient care above all else. Personal feelings, pride, and anger could not outweigh a life in jeopardy. Naomi approached Dr. Romanoff, Emmanuel at her side. She felt the heaviness of the moment settle over them like a shroud. "Doctor," Naomi said quietly, steadying her voice. "We have a critical trauma case. The patient may not survive without immediate intervention." Dr. Romanoff glanced at her, eyes filled with remorse and uncertainty. The weight of his earlier actions pressed down on him visibly. He had injured his professional standing and, worse, harmed a colleague. Still, a human life now balanced on the tip of a knife. What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Emmanuel stepped in, arms folded, voice firm but calm. "We are willing to let you assist, under strict supervision. You will follow Dr. Santos's lead and every step will be observed by our head nurse and a member of the administrative team. You will not be alone in that or." It was a remarkable concession, proof that their code of ethics ran deeper than their outrage. For a moment, Dr. Romanoff looked ready to object, perhaps to demand his usual autonomy, but he caught the urgency in Naomi's eyes. This was not the time for pride. "I understand," he said softly, voice raw with contrition. "I'll do whatever you require. Just let me help." They rushed into action. Dr. Santos prepped the patient, checking vitals and ordering blood. Naomi, trained and steady, moved to assist with 4 lines and sedation. Emmanuel stood at a small observation window outside the makeshift surgical suite, arms crossed, watching closely. A senior nurse and an HR representative joined him, their presence ensuring accountability. Inside, the lights beamed down on the patient's pallid face. Dr. Romanoff scrubbed in, hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his gloves. He spoke quietly to Dr. Santos, confirming their approach. There was no room for ego now, only teamwork and skill. Naomi noticed how differently Dr. Romanoff carried himself, no barked orders, no dismissive sneers. Instead, he asked for instruments in a calm, measured tone. He called out his steps clearly, allowing Dr. Santos to guide the course of action. Naomi passed surgical tools and kept a careful eye on monitors, her focus honed to a razor's edge. The patient's condition was precarious, but as minutes stretched into an hour, a fragile order emerged. Dr. Romanoff's hands moved deftly, controlling bleeding and repairing internal damage. Dr. Santos nodded approvingly at critical junctures, and the HR representative quietly took notes in the background, documenting every word and gesture. When the procedure ended, the patient's vitals stabilized. A heavy sigh of relief spread through the room like a gentle wave. Dr. Romanoff stepped back, removing his gloves, his brow damp with sweat. He looked to Naomi and Dr. Santos, voice subdued, "Thank you for letting me help." Naomi met his gaze. Though her cheek still remembered the sting of his hand, she also recognized the gravity of what had just transpired. By allowing him this chance, they had refused to let one act of violence wholly define him or poison their shared mission. His future here was still uncertain, but for tonight, they had saved a life by upholding their core values, even in the face of personal pain. Outside in the hallway, Emmanuel and the observers conferred quietly. They had witnessed something unexpected, a doctor who had lashed out in anger now fighting to redeem himself by saving a life. The conflict wasn't over, there would still be consequences, accountability, and changes in how the hospital managed its staff. But there was also a glimmer of hope that even the darkest moments could lead to understanding and a renewed commitment to doing good. As Naomi stepped out of the surgical area, Emmanuel gently took her hand. The silence between them spoke volumes. Together, they had faced betrayal, demanded justice, and still upheld the dignity and mission of the hospital. Tonight's events had revealed not only a breaking point but also a path forward, a more human, compassionate, and principled way of healing wounds, both physical and moral. In the early hours of the morning, as the hospital gradually settled into a quieter rhythm, Naomi stood near a window overlooking the parking lot. Dawn had begun to streak the sky with pale pinks and soft golds, casting a gentle light through the glass. She could see her reflection faintly, her own eyes, still touched by sorrow but also resolve. Behind her, Emmanuel approached quietly, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. The events of the night weighed on both of them. They had confronted injustice, demanded accountability, and still managed to uphold the central mission of caring for patients. Naomi felt proud and yet unsettled, as if the pieces of the puzzle were not fully arranged. "Are you all right?" Emmanuel asked softly, leaning in so that no one else would hear. Most of the staff had returned to their duties, charting, checking on patients, and resupplying equipment. The adrenaline and shock were beginning to fade, leaving behind a calm resolve to move forward. Naomi nodded slowly. "I'm tired," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm glad we're taking steps to set things right. I know it won't all be resolved instantly, but at least we didn't look the other way." He squeezed her hand, his voice warm and steady. "We'll see this through. Together." They both turned as Dr. Santos stepped into view, clipboard tucked under his arm. He offered a slight smile. "The patient we operated on is stable," he said, relief evident in his tone. "We'll keep him under observation, but it looks promising." He paused, then glanced down the hallway where Dr. Romanoff had retreated after the surgery. "As for Romanoff, I'm not sure what will happen next." Naomi followed his gaze. She couldn't deny the complexity of her feelings. On one hand, Dr. Romanoff's violent outburst deserved consequences. On the other, his skill had saved a life tonight, and he had shown uncharacteristic humility and respect. It was a contradiction that the hospital would have to navigate carefully. "I'm certain HR and the administration will outline a course of action," Emmanuel said. "We've made it clear, this hospital will not tolerate violence or disrespect. At the same time, we're in the business of healing, and that includes giving people a chance to learn and change, if they genuinely want it." As if summoned by their words, Dr. Romanoff emerged from around the corner. He moved slowly, shoulders hunched and eyes downcast. Gone was the brusque arrogance that had characterized him in the ER. In its place was an uneasy mixture of shame and uncertainty. He approached the trio hesitantly, stopping a few steps away as if unsure he had the right to come closer. Naomi's heart fluttered with apprehension. She braced herself, ready to stand firm and dignified no matter what he said. Emmanuel shifted slightly closer to her, a quiet show of support. Dr. Romanoff began, then hesitated, running a hand through his graying hair. His voice sounded thinner without the force of authority behind it. "I need to apologize. Properly. I know I said something at the meeting, but that wasn't enough." Naomi regarded him calmly. The memory of the slap still stung in her mind, if not on her cheek. "I'm listening," she said evenly. He looked her in the eyes, his own gaze wavering. "I was out of line. More than that, I was cruel. You did nothing to deserve what happened, and no amount of stress or frustration excuses my behavior. I'm sorry for what I did to you, both physically and emotionally. I know I've violated your trust, as well as the hospital's standards." Naomi studied him. She saw no trace of bravado, no attempt to shift blame. His apology felt genuine, and while that didn't erase the hurt, it mattered that he faced her honestly now. "Thank you for saying that," she replied, voice subdued but sincere. "I hope you understand that an apology is just the beginning. There's a lot you need to do to make amends." Dr. Romanoff nodded, his shoulders sagging in relief that he'd at least been given the chance to speak. "I know. I'll cooperate fully with the investigation. I'll accept the consequences that HR and the administration decide on. And I'm willing to get counseling, anger management, whatever it takes to ensure nothing like this happens again." Emmanuel watched him closely. He, too, needed to see action, not just words. "The hospital's values are non-negotiable," he said. "We're here to heal and to help. If you're committed to rebuilding trust, you'll show it over time, not just in one conversation. We'll be watching, and we'll hold you accountable." Dr. Romanoff swallowed and looked from Emmanuel to Naomi. "I understand," he said. "I'll do my best." With that, he stepped away, giving them space. He walked down the corridor, shoulders still bowed, as if carrying the weight of his wrongdoing. Dr. Santos tapped his clipboard lightly against his leg, eyebrows raised. "I never thought I'd see Romanoff apologizing like that." Naomi offered a faint smile. "People can surprise you," she said softly. "Sometimes for the worst, sometimes for the better. The trio stood quietly for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the night. Yes, the hospital would now undergo an official review of its policies to prevent such incidents. Training sessions, new protocols, and open forums for staff to voice concerns would follow. Naomi would be at those discussions, contributing her perspective to ensure that everyone was treated with dignity. As the first rays of true daylight spilled down the corridor, Emmanuel and Naomi turned toward their respective responsibilities, he to the administrative offices, where he would brief the board members in the coming days, and she to the patients who needed her gentle touch and reassuring smile. The night had revealed deep flaws and sparked painful conflicts, but it had also shown that this hospital, built on principles of healing and respect, could rise to the challenge. Naomi took a last look at her reflection in the window. The bruise on her cheek would fade, and she knew that her inner strength, forged in moments like these, would only grow. In that sense, even this terrible incident could become part of a larger narrative of courage and moral clarity. She stepped away from the window and into the rhythm of a new day, determined, hopeful, and unwavering in the belief that justice and compassion would guide them all forward. Over the following week, Sunbeam Medical Center felt subtly transformed. The corridors, once filled with a quiet, methodical hum, now carried an undercurrent of determination and renewal. It began when the hospital's Human Resources Department posted a notice about the upcoming training sessions, workshops on workplace respect, communication, and conflict resolution. Everyone, from senior surgeons to part-time janitors, would attend. Naomi stepped into the break room one early afternoon and found Lisa arranging a tray of fresh fruit and pastries for the nursing staff. A bright poster on the bulletin board read, "Our values, dignity, equality, compassion." These were the hospital's core principles, but now they were being emphasized with new urgency. As Naomi read the lines, she noticed Lisa's sidelong glance, warm and encouraging. "How are you feeling?" Lisa asked quietly, placing a bowl of grapes on the table. Her voice held genuine concern. Around them, a few nurses pretended to busy themselves, obviously curious to hear Naomi's response. Since the night of the incident, a respectful silence had prevailed. No one wanted to pry or gossip, but many cared deeply about what Naomi had endured. "I'm doing better," Naomi answered, offering a small but genuine smile. "It helps that everyone is taking this seriously. I'm looking forward to these training sessions. If we can learn from what happened, then maybe it won't be in vain." Some nurses nodded, relief plain on their faces. The tension that had followed Dr. Romanoff's assault on Naomi was easing as the hospital showed real commitment to improvement. Now that a formal investigation was underway, staff felt confident that the administration wouldn't simply sweep the matter aside. Outside the break room, Emmanuel and Ms. Price from HR were finalizing details of Dr. Romanoff's required remediation. He would attend mandatory anger management courses and ethics seminars. His hospital privileges would remain restricted until he demonstrated sustained progress. Moreover, a peer review committee, comprised of doctors, nurses, and administrators, would monitor his conduct closely. Emmanuel's voice was steady as he spoke to Ms. Price, "We must ensure that no one ever feels unprotected here. Naomi's experience should become a turning point that reminds us why respect is non-negotiable." Ms. Price nodded, taking notes. She was clearly impressed by the measured, principled approach. "I'll schedule follow-ups with Dr. Romanoff to track his progress. And I'd also like to give Naomi an opportunity to provide feedback directly into our revised policies, if she's comfortable." Emmanuel smiled at the suggestion. Including Naomi's voice in shaping new policies was exactly the kind of step that would not only heal old wounds but prevent new ones. "I think she'd appreciate that," he said. "She's always valued fairness and cooperation, and I know she wants to be part of the solution." Later that same day, Dr. Romanoff stood outside the very conference room where his fate had first been questioned. He fiddled with the collar of his white coat, which he wore now more as a symbol of responsibility than authority. He understood that he had a long way to go before anyone would trust him again. Fear and uncertainty gnawed at him, yet he knew he must face this challenge with humility. Inside, Dr. Santos, acting as a mentor of sorts, waited with arms folded. When Romanoff entered, the pediatric doctor greeted him not with anger, but with a level gaze. "I'm here to discuss your plan for corrective action," Dr. Santos said. "I want to help ensure you understand what's expected. This isn't about punishment alone, it's about making you into a better colleague, if that's what you truly want." Romanoff met his gaze steadily. "I do want that," he said, voice sincere. "I realize I've let down not only Naomi but the entire hospital. I intend to fix that." They reviewed the course requirements, the committee's oversight, and the timeframe for showing measurable improvement. Meanwhile, in a sunlit alcove near the main entrance, Naomi found a few minutes to sit with a patient's family, offering reassurance and kindness. She felt steadier than before, more certain of her place here. The family thanked her for her warmth, and as she rose, a young intern approached cautiously. "Nurse Johnson," he said quietly, a hint of admiration in his voice. "I just wanted to say I respect how you handled everything. You stood up for yourself and for all of us, really. It means a lot." Touched, Naomi nodded. "Thank you." Standing up was the only choice. But it wasn't just me, everyone who insisted on doing the right thing made a difference. She looked around at the bustling hallway, where people of different backgrounds and roles worked side by side, all driven by a common purpose. This place matters too much to let fear or disrespect take root. Over the coming days, preparations for staff training intensified. Flyers and emails detailed the schedule of mandatory sessions, building a culture of respect, emotional intelligence in healthcare, and effective communication under stress. Some employees grumbled at the extra hours, but most understood the importance. The hospital's leadership approached these sessions not as a box to check, but as a genuine opportunity to strengthen their community. As Naomi headed home after her shift, the sky was painted with the warm colors of dusk. She reflected on the changes she saw taking shape, conversations held in quieter, more thoughtful tones, a doctor once feared now treading carefully, seeking redemption, colleagues openly discussing their feelings and boundaries. It would take time, of course, to rebuild trust and heal the invisible wounds of that terrible night. But if there was one thing Naomi knew from years of nursing, it was that healing rarely came instantly. It emerged through careful treatment, proper attention, and a willingness to learn and grow. In this chapter of the hospital's story, they had committed themselves to that healing process. As she stepped into the cool evening air, Naomi knew they were taking unsteady but earnest steps toward a brighter, more respectful future. Several months later, the hospital had settled into a more thoughtful routine. The long summer afternoons had given way to a gentle fall, and leaves outside the windows of Sunbeam Medical Center shimmered in shades of rust and gold. Inside, the atmosphere felt renewed. Hallways, once only utilitarian passages, now carried voices that spoke more kindly, and patients sensed a shift in the air, an intangible but comforting warmth. Naomi stepped into the main lobby on her day off, called in by Emmanuel for a special announcement. She moved through the crowds with ease, receiving friendly nods and smiles from staff and visitors alike. Some remembered the difficult night that had sparked these changes, and others simply appreciated the new sense of unity that spread among the hospital's caregivers. In the past months, every staff member had completed the mandatory training sessions on communication, respect, and emotional well-being under pressure. What had begun as a reaction to a single moment of violence had grown into a broad initiative that improved teamwork and trust. Nurses, doctors, technicians, and administrative employees reported feeling more heard, more valued. The HR department had implemented a new open-door policy, encouraging staff to voice concerns without fear of retaliation. Now, a small crowd gathered in the hospital's bright, airy lobby for a ceremony. Emmanuel stood at the center, looking poised and proud. Ms. Price from HR was at his side, holding a folder of documents, and Dr. Santos hovered nearby, arms comfortably folded, a subtle smile on his face. Against a backdrop of potted plants and a cheerful mural, the setting felt hopeful. Naomi spotted Dr. Romanoff at the edge of the crowd. He wore a clean white coat and stood quietly, shoulders squared, his demeanor respectful. Over the past weeks, he had attended every scheduled seminar and fulfilled all the requirements set forth by the review committee. He had apologized not only to Naomi but also to the entire ER staff, acknowledging the harm he'd done and pledging to do better. He had worked under supervision, accepting guidance from peers, learning to ask, not demand, help when stress mounted. And the difference showed. He consulted colleagues as partners, not subordinates, and even took time to thank the nurses after challenging procedures. While trust was still a work in progress, each considerate act was a brick laid in the slow, steady rebuilding of his reputation. With everyone assembled, Emmanuel cleared his throat. "Thank you all for being here," he began. His voice carried easily, calm and reassuring. "We've gathered to mark a new chapter in this hospital's history. After thorough review, we are finalizing the policy changes that we believe will ensure a safer, more respectful environment for every person who works or receives care within these walls." He nodded to Ms. Price, who stepped forward with a smile. "These updated policies clarify expectations, provide clear channels for reporting mistreatment, and ensure that training in empathy and professionalism remains ongoing," she said. "We've learned that a single incident can reveal deep-rooted issues, and we're committed to addressing them honestly." Naomi felt a gentle hand on her shoulder and looked up to see Emmanuel's quiet smile. He knew how important this moment was. Invited to speak, Naomi took a small step forward, meeting the eyes of the crowd. "I want to thank everyone for embracing these changes," she said. "What happened to me was painful, but it also showed how strongly we all believe in making this place better. I've seen our staff support each other, listen more closely, and handle disagreements with patience and understanding. Watching this transformation has reminded me why I became a nurse, to help people heal, not just physically, but in all the ways that matter." Warm applause rippled through the crowd. Many staff members looked at Naomi with pride and gratitude. In her stance, steady and calm, they saw strength and compassion that had guided them through a difficult period. Emmanuel cleared his throat again and addressed Dr. Romanoff directly, his tone measured but not unkind. "Doctor," he said, "you have worked hard to show that you can meet our standards of respect and cooperation. The review committee has decided to restore your full privileges, with the understanding that you will continue upholding the values we hold dear." Dr. Romanoff inclined his head, his voice subdued as he replied, "I understand. And I won't forget what I've learned here. I'm grateful for the chance to prove myself worthy of your trust." For a moment, silence hung in the air, charged with the memory of old wounds and the promise of a better future. Then, as if prompted by some unspoken cue, the crowd parted, allowing staff members to return to their duties. Life at the hospital would go on, patients would be treated, emergencies would arise, and long shifts would test their resilience. But now they would face those challenges with a renewed sense of purpose and unity. As people began to drift away, Naomi and Emmanuel lingered. Outside, sunlight streamed through the lobby's large windows, painting the floor with patterns of light and shadow. Naomi took Emmanuel's hand, grateful for his unwavering support. She was proud of what they had accomplished, not just for themselves, but for everyone who worked and received care here. "I think we did the right thing," she said softly, her eyes shining. "We didn't let anger or fear dictate our choices. We chose to be honest, firm, and kind." Emmanuel nodded, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "That's what true healing looks like," he said, addressing the harm, taking responsibility, and growing stronger together. And so, as the hospital buzzed back to its normal rhythm, nurses checking charts, doctors scrubbing in for surgeries, receptionists greeting patients with warm smiles, Naomi and Emmanuel stood as witnesses to the quiet miracle of positive change. They had taken a moment of pain and injustice and turned it into an opportunity for compassion, respect, and a brighter path forward for everyone under the hospital's roof. That I believe the story's ending is both uplifting and inspiring. It shows how a moment of wrongdoing doesn't have to define a person or an institution. Instead, it can become a catalyst for positive change, unity, and a renewed commitment to respect. The transformation of the hospital's culture, the accountability taken by all parties involved, and the resilience displayed by the characters send a powerful message, that even in the face of injustice, people can come together to build a better future. If you appreciated this resolution, don't forget to give this a like, subscribe for more stories and insights, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments.